He mocked her for being poorer than the mafia boss, put his ring on her finger before everyone. He pointed at her dress in front of 200 people and laughed. Not a quiet laugh, not an embarrassed afterward laugh. The kind that carries across a marble ballroom, that makes other people's conversations die mid-sentence, that finds the exact frequency of humiliation and broadcasts it. Preston Caldwell, real estate heir, third-generation money, man who had never once sewn a button back on anything he owned, looked at Claire Whitmore's navy dress and decided the most important thing he could do with his evening was make sure she understood she didn't belong there. She was 27. She had $43 in her checking account. She had made that dress herself with fabric from a discount bolt and a second-hand zipper. And she did not flinch. What happened next, what that moment set into motion, will change everything you think you know about who belongs where and why. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because this is exactly the kind of story we tell here, and you do not want to walk in halfway. Hit that like button and drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. Claire Whitmore learned early that certain kinds of tired don't go away with sleep. Her mother, Margaret, knew that kind of tired. Claire had watched it accumulate over years, the particular exhaustion of a woman working double shifts in a hotel laundry room, coming home with her hands red and swollen, still making dinner, still asking Evan about his homework, still pretending for the sake of her children that the situation was manageable. Margaret was not a woman who complained. That was part of the problem. She internalized everything so thoroughly that Claire, at 12 years old, didn't fully understand. They were struggling until the electricity got shut off on a January night. And Margaret sat at the kitchen table and couldn't stop crying for the first time Claire had ever seen. Her father had died 4 months earlier, a factory accident, insufficient insurance, a settlement that was far less than the lawyers had promised and gone within 8 months. Claire was 12, Evan was 7, and from that kitchen table moment forward, Claire understood something fundamental shifted. Not gradually, all at once. She became someone who noticed what needed doing and did it before she was asked. She learned to cook because her mother didn't always have the energy by the time she got home. She learned to sew because new clothes were not a financial reality, but a needle and thread and fabric from a church sale were. She helped Evan with math. She barely understood herself, working through textbooks at the kitchen table until she understood it well enough to explain it to him. She was not a perfect sister. She lost her patience with him sometimes. She said things she regretted. She was 12, then 13, then 14, carrying a weight that didn't come with instructions. But she kept going. School was the one place where carrying weight actually helped her. She was ferocious in a classroom. Not because she was naturally brilliant, she was smart, but not effortlessly so, but because she had learned that the difference between understanding something and not understanding it was almost always time and stubbornness. She had both. She stayed late. She came early. She asked questions that other students were too embarrassed to ask and didn't care that they weren't. Fashion was something she came to through necessity and stayed with because it became the first thing in her life that felt like hers. It started with alterations, taking in a pair of second-hand jeans so they actually fit, letting down a hem, replacing a broken zipper. Then she started actually studying garments, not fashion magazines, which felt impossibly distant, but the clothes themselves. The way a seam distributed tension across fabric, why a collar lay flat or buckled. What happened when you cut on the grain versus against it? She checked out every sewing and pattern-making book the Philadelphia Public Library had, some of them twice. By 16, she was making most of her own clothes. By 17, she was making alterations for neighbors and earning $40 or $50 a month, doing it not enough to change anything, but enough to feel like she was contributing rather than just consuming. She kept a notebook. She started filling it at 15 rough sketches at first, ideas that felt too big for her current reality. Silhouettes she wanted to try. Structural experiments she had no fabric budget for. Draping techniques she'd read about but never attempted. The notebook became the place where Claire allowed herself to want things without guilt. Everything outside the notebook required pragmatism. The notebook was where she kept the parts of herself she couldn't afford to act on yet. She earned the scholarship to the Fashion Institute in New York through 3 rounds of applications, 2 rejections, and a portfolio she assembled over 6 months by photographing every piece she'd made and printing the photos at the library for 25 cents each. Scholarship letter arrived on a Tuesday. Margaret cried. Evan didn't understand entirely, but cheered because his sister was crying and seemed happy, and that was good enough for him. New York was harder than Claire had imagined, and she had not imagined it being easy. The institute itself was fine. She was technically strong, she worked harder than most of her classmates, and the professors respected her. But the social architecture of Manhattan's fashion world revealed itself clearly within the first semester, and it was not a meritocracy. The students whose parents had connections to buyers and editors and showroom directors had a different kind of education running parallel to the official one. They were learning a map Claire didn't have access to. Who to know, where to be seen, which parties to attend, and who to stand next to when you were there. She graduated at the top of her class. That was real, and she was proud of it. But the top of her class came with a diploma, not a phone book of people willing to return her calls. 36 applications, 12 polite rejections, 11 non-responses, 7 interviews that went well until they didn't. She was never told explicitly why she didn't get those positions. She didn't need to be. She had watched enough to understand the pattern. The candidates who got hired weren't necessarily better. They were better connected. They came from the right schools, supplemented by the right internships, arranged by the right parents. They knew how to walk into a room and make the people already in it feel comfortable rather than challenged. Claire made people feel challenged without meaning to, Kat. She was direct when indirection was expected. She spoke plainly when embellishment was the norm. She could not perform the particular kind of comfortable deference that certain gatekeepers required. Felt dishonest, and dishonesty had never come naturally to her. Hawthorne and Vale was not what she had been reaching for. It was a prestigious firm, genuinely excellent work came out of that atelier, but the position she was hired into was essentially invisible. Seamstress, alterations and repairs. She sat in a workroom 2 floors below the design studio and fixed other people's mistakes with her name on nothing. She was good at it. She was excellent at it. Her eye for structural problems in a garment was remarkable. She could feel an error in a shoulder seam through the fabric before she could even see it. The senior designers knew who to send a complicated repair job to. But knowing her name for that purpose and knowing her name as a designer were entirely different things. The notebook filled up. She started a second one, then a third. She did not discuss this with anyone at the firm. She was not naive enough to think that the people who depended on her invisibility would suddenly volunteer to make her visible. The charity gala was a client event. Hawthorne and Vale occasionally put junior staff members at tables for optics. It looked collegial. It suggested the firm valued its people at every level, and it cost the senior partners very little since the tickets were donated. Claire was one of 4 junior staff invited. She almost didn't go. She had worked 11 hours that day, and her feet hurt, and she owned nothing appropriate. She made the dress in 4 evenings. Navy fabric, structured bodice, a neckline that was elegant without requiring jewelry she didn't own. She cut it on a Friday night, sewed through Saturday, fitted it on herself Sunday morning by setting up her phone camera and adjusting until it was right. It wasn't perfect. The left side of the hem was 2 millimeters lower than the right. She discovered this later, but at the gala, standing in a ballroom full of women wearing things that cost more than her monthly rent, she did not feel inadequate. She felt like herself, which was the only thing she had ever actually been able to control. Preston Caldwell entered the gala the way men like him entered every room, preceded by his own certainty. He was 34, handsome in a way that had been maintained through the effortless combination of good genetics and money, and he had the specific confidence of someone who had never genuinely failed at anything, because the infrastructure around him had absorbed every mistake before it could define him. He knew people, he was known. He moved through that ballroom with the easy authority of a man who had never once questioned whether a room wanted him in it. He noticed Claire standing near one of the cocktail tables during the pre-dinner reception. His assessment of her dress was almost automatic, the way someone with his background processed clothing had become reflexive. Fabric wasn't right. The cut was technically accomplished, but the material was clearly inexpensive. He couldn't have explained exactly how he knew, but he knew. He said something to the woman standing next to him. Comment, delivered at a volume that was not quite sotto voce, that communicated precisely what he thought without requiring him to say it in plain terms. The woman laughed. The man beside her caught it and smiled. Claire heard it. She turned and looked directly at Preston Caldwell. Not with tears, which might have satisfied him. Not with embarrassment, which would have confirmed his assessment. She looked at him with an expression that was simply level and clear, the expression of someone who has already decided this moment doesn't get to cost her anything. Preston's smile held, but something in it shifted almost imperceptibly. He hadn't expected that. He had expected the dress, and then the reaction that went with the dress. He got the dress, and then something that made no sense to him. He said it louder then, because when something doesn't react the way you expect it to, the easiest response is to push harder. He made a comment, audible to the 6 or 8 people immediately around them, about how the gala's dress code had apparently become somewhat creative in its interpretation. He looked at Claire's dress as he said it. He looked at her. He smiled again, waiting. 200 people didn't all hear it. Maybe 30 did. That was enough. The silence that spread across that corner of the room had a specific texture, the discomfort of witnesses who aren't going to intervene but don't entirely want to be there. Claire set her glass down on the table behind her. She straightened her shoulders, not dramatically, not performatively, but the way some does when they are recalibrating the weight they're carrying and making sure it's distributed correctly. She looked at Preston Caldwell for a moment longer. Just long enough. Then she turned and walked away. She did not run. She did not speed up. She moved at exactly the pace she chose, across the ballroom floor, and she did not look back. She stayed another 45 minutes, because leaving immediately would have felt like retreat. She ate dinner. She spoke to a woman from the firm's accounting department about a vacation the woman had taken. She drank 1 glass of wine. Then she said her goodbyes, retrieved her coat from the check, and took the subway home. On the train she sat, with her hands folded in her lap, and looked at the dark tunnel walls sliding past the window. She was not fine. She had not been fine in that ballroom, and she was not fine on the subway. The specific humiliation of having your poverty pointed at in public, in front of people who cannot help you, and some of whom were quietly relieved, it wasn't them that doesn't dissolve, because you hold your chin up. It stays with you. It gets on the train with you. But there is a particular kind of woman, not a perfect woman, not a woman without wounds, who does not let the wound choose the direction. Claire sat in the subway car and thought about the notebook in her locker at the Hawthorne and Vale workroom. She thought about the dress she was wearing. She thought about the fact that she had built something with her own hands that was genuinely good, and that one man's cruelty did not change the quality of what she'd made. It did not fix the evening. It did not make her unhurt. But it was something real to hold on to, and she held it. She had $43 in her checking account, and a second-hand zipper, and a notebook full of ideas she hadn't shown anyone. She had also, on the way out of that ballroom, memorized Preston Caldwell's face. Not out of a plan for revenge. Claire was not particularly interested in revenge. She was interested in something harder and slower and more satisfying than that. She was interested in making the version of herself that had been dismissed tonight into something so undeniably real that dismissal eventually became impossible. She didn't know yet what that would require. She didn't know yet whose path would cross hers in the weeks ahead, or what a man with a flaw in a jacket shoulder lining would set into motion. She just knew she wasn't done. She wasn't close to done. The subway car rattled under the East River, and Claire Whitmore sat in it with her chin up and her hands folded, and her $43 and her notebook full of dreams, and she rode all the way home. 3 weeks passed. Claire did not think about Preston Caldwell every day. That would have given him too much real estate in a mind that had more important things to house. She thought about him the way you think about a splinter. You can't quite reach, not constantly, but at specific moments, when something shifted wrong and reminded you, it was still there. A Wednesday morning, when the senior pattern cutter walked past her workroom without acknowledging the repair, she'd stayed until 9 to finish. A Thursday afternoon, when she overheard two junior designers discussing portfolio submissions for an internal showcase, and realized no one had told her such a showcase existed. Small moments, accumulated pressure. She worked. That was the thing she knew how to do when everything else felt unstable. She worked and she kept the notebook, and she did not discuss either with anyone at the firm. Evening, everything changed, began without ceremony. It was a Tuesday, 22 days after the gala. Claire was alone in the workroom. The rest of the alteration staff had left at 6, and it was now closer to 8. She had stayed because a bespoke jacket had come back from a client fitting with a notation from the senior tailor that read simply, "shoulder lining." Left side, and Claire had looked at it for 3 minutes before she understood what missed and for she actually need to be done to fix it correctly. She had the jacket opened on the work table, the lining carefully separated from the shell at the shoulder seam when she heard the elevator. The Hawthorne and Vale atelier occupied the top 2 floors of a midtown building. After 6, the main lobby staff went home, and clients were supposed to be buzzed up by appointment only. Claire heard the elevator reach the floor, heard the doors open, heard footsteps in the corridor that were deliberate and unhurried, the footsteps of someone who had never in his life felt the need to hurry because of another person's schedule. She did not look up immediately. The man who appeared in the workroom doorway was 40 years old, though he carried it in a way that made age feel like an asset rather than a concession. He was not large in the way that announces itself, but there was a quality to how he occupied space, a stillness that somehow registered as more physical presence, not less. He wore a charcoal suit, no tie, the collar button open. The suit itself was exceptional. Even from across the room, Claire could see that. The front desk said someone was still in. His voice was even. Not warm exactly, but not cold. The voice of a man who had learned to control his instrument the same way he controlled everything else. "We're closed," Claire said, not looking up from the lining. "If you have an appointment, I have a jacket." He held up a garment bag. The Hawthorne office called and said it was ready. Claire set down her needle. "Who told you to come up tonight?" "Someone named Davis. Marcus Davis, senior account manager, who had apparently scheduled a client pickup for 8 in the evening without telling anyone who was actually still in the building." Claire absorbed this information with the specific resigned quality of someone who had stopped surprised by Marcus Davis's administrative failures. "Can I see your name?" she asked. "Marlowe. Vincent Marlowe." She didn't know the name. Later she would understand that this ignorance was actually a kind of protection, that she spoke to him for the next 40 minutes, with a directness she might have adjusted had she known exactly who she was talking to. But in that moment he was simply a client with a pickup, and she was a woman with a workroom and standards. She retrieved the garment bag with his name on it from the rack, a midnight blue jacket, part of a 3-piece commission she knew, had cost somewhere in the range of $4,000, and began to unzip it. She stopped. She pulled the jacket from the bag and held it at arm's length under the workroom lights. "I can't give you this," she said. A beat of silence. "Excuse me." The left shoulder, she turned it slightly. "The lining's been attached with tension. You put this on and wear it for 3 hours, and you'll feel it pulling across the back." Whoever finished this rushed the attachment on the final 1/4 inch. She looked at him directly. "I'm not sending this out of here like this." Vincent Marlowe looked at the jacket. Then he looked at her. "It's 8 o'clock, he said. "I'm aware. You're going to fix it. Tonight. I'm going to fix it properly," she said. "Tonight or otherwise. If you want to come back Thursday." "I need it tomorrow morning." Claire looked at the jacket, then back at him. The repair she was already doing on the other commission was going to take another hour minimum. This would add 40 minutes if she rushed it, which she would not do, so closer to an hour. It was already 8. "Then sit down," she said, "and don't distract me." It was not the way Hawthorne and Vale staff spoke to clients. She knew this. She also knew Marcus Davis had sent a man to pick up a jacket that was not ready to leave the building, and that the person left to manage the consequences of this was her, alone, at 8 in the evening. And she was not in the mood to additionally manage the social performance of pretending the situation was different than it was. Vincent Marlowe sat down. He sat in the client chair against the workroom wall, a chair that was there primarily for fitting consultations and was almost never actually used, and he sat in it with that same quality of stillness, watching her work without speaking. Claire returned to the lining of the other jacket for 10 minutes, completing the section she was on before she could responsibly stop. Then she transferred her attention to Marlowe's jacket, laid it on the secondary table, and began carefully opening the shoulder lining with a seam ripper. "You can see that from across the room," he said. "I can feel it," she said. "The tension is wrong. The fabric registers it before you can see it clearly." Another silence, not uncomfortable, the specific silence of someone paying attention rather than waiting for their turn to speak. "How long have you been doing this? Alterations and repairs?" 4 years. "Sewing seriously, 15. You started at 12. My mother couldn't afford to buy clothes that fit us correctly. Someone had to fix them." She hadn't meant to say that last part. It came out with the bluntness of someone who had stopped editing herself after 6 hours alone in a workroom. She glanced up briefly, prepared to recalibrate, and found him watching her with an expression that was not pity, something more like recognition, though she couldn't have explained why she read it that way. "What's your name?" he asked. "Claire Whitmore." "Are you always this direct with clients, Claire?" "I'm always this direct," she said. "The client part doesn't change it much." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The shadow of one. She worked. He watched. The building settled around them with its nighttime sounds, the faint mechanical pulse of the HVAC, the distant murmur of midtown traffic 40 feet below. Claire the lining with the correct tension, working the needle through the points where the previous finisher had rushed, feeling each stitch seat properly. Her hands were steady. They were always steady when she was working. It was the one context in which every other variable fell away, and only the problem in front of her existed. You don't talk when you work," he said after about 20 minutes. "Neither do you. I'm watching," I noticed. She trimmed the thread and lifted the jacket, turning it in the light. She pressed the shoulder lightly with 3 fingers, feeling for the tension distribution. Even, she did it again. Still even. She walked to where he was sitting and held it out. "Try it on." He stood. He was taller than she'd registered from across the room and put the jacket on. He rolled his shoulders once carefully. He moved his right arm forward, then his left. He held still for a moment, feeling. "That's different," he said. "It's how it's supposed to feel." He looked at her in the mirror above the fitting ledge. "You fixed what the tailor missed. The tailor who finished it was in a hurry. It happens." She kept her voice neutral. It was not her job to throw the firm's staff under the bus to a client, regardless of what she thought privately. "But you're not in a hurry. Not with someone else's work," she said. "Not with mine either, but especially not with someone else's." He turned from the mirror and looked at her directly. This close, she could see that his eyes were dark brown, not black, as they'd appeared from across the room, and that processed information with a speed and depth that made her understand, without yet knowing anything specific about him, that very little escaped them. "What's your involvement with the firm?" he asked. "Alterations, repairs." She began putting her tools away. "The workroom." Not design. It was not phrased as a question. Claire set down the seam ripper with more deliberateness than was necessary. "No," she said, "not design." "Whose choice is that?" She looked at him. "That's a complicated question." "I have time. I don't," she said, which was not entirely true. The other still needed another 30 minutes. But she wasn't ready to have that conversation with a stranger at 8:15 on a Tuesday night in an empty workroom. He accepted this without pushing. He removed the jacket, folded it over his arm, with a care that told her he understood quality in a way some clients never bothered to, and he picked up the garment bag from the table. "Thank you, Miss Whitmore. The firm will invoice you for the repair." "That's fine." He moved toward the door and stopped. "I'll be placing another order next week. A shirt commission. He looked at her over his shoulder. I'd like you on the fitting. Claire felt something tighten slightly in her chest, not unease exactly, but the instinct to be careful. He had said it as a preference, not a demand. There was a difference. I don't typically do fittings, she said. I'm in the workroom. Then I'll request an exception. He met her eyes. I'll speak to Davis. He left. Claire stood in the empty workroom and listened to the elevator descend. She stood there for a moment longer than was necessary. Then she turned back to the work table and the unfinished jacket and the remaining 30 minutes of work she had to do before she could go home. She did not think about Vincent Marlowe for the rest of the evening. She thought about him on the subway. He came back the following Wednesday. Not the next week, the following Wednesday, 8 days later, which meant he had moved his appointment up. He said nothing about this. He appeared at the atelier at 2 in the afternoon for a shirt-fitting consultation, and Davis, who had apparently agreed to the exception without mentioning it to Claire until 40 minutes before, sent down a message to the workroom that read, "Client requesting you upstairs, 2 p.m. Marlowe commission." Claire read the message twice. Then she washed her hands, changed into the second blouse she kept in her locker for client-facing situations, and went upstairs. The shirt commission was for 4 pieces. Vincent sat across from her while the senior shirtmaker took his measurements, and he spoke to Claire, not to the shirtmaker, throughout the consultation. About fabric, he wanted a Sea Island cotton for 2 of the shirts, and he had opinions about thread count that were more informed than she expected. About construction, he asked about collar construction with specific questions that required specific answers, and he listened to her responses with the full, quiet attention she was beginning to understand was simply how he operated. It unsettled her slightly, not because it was inappropriate, because it was entirely appropriate, and she wasn't accustomed to being listened to in this building. "You have opinions about this," he said at one point. "About collar construction?" "Yes, say them. It's not my commission." "Say them anyway." She said them. He listened. He changed the specification for one of the 4 shirts based on what she said, overriding the shirtmaker's previous note without apology or elaboration, which the shirtmaker accepted with the resigned professionalism of someone who understood which side of the relationships held the invoice. He came back the following week for a vest fitting. He came back the week after that to look at fabric samples for a second jacket commission. Each time he requested Claire. Each time Davis accommodated without asking Claire whether she wanted to be accommodated. She did not bring this up with Davis. She understood the political geometry of her position too well to create a confrontation over what was, by any objective measure, a positive development. A high-value client specifically requesting her presence was useful to the firm. That usefulness created a small, delicate amount of leverage that had not existed before. She was not going to set it on fire, but she paid attention to what was happening. Between fittings, she and Vincent talked, not always about fabric or construction, about other things, incrementally, the way 2 people develop a territory of conversation over multiple short encounters. He asked about the workroom. She told him carefully edited versions of what daily life in the alterations department actually looked like. He asked about Philadelphia. She told him about Evan, who was now 19 and working at a warehouse and taking community college classes 2 nights a week. She did not tell him about her mother's hands or the electricity shutting off in January, but she told him enough that he could read the outline of the thing. He told her very little in return. She noticed this. He answered questions with the minimal, accurate response that addressed the question without revealing anything surrounding it. He was good at it smooth enough that she almost didn't notice she was receiving so much less than she was giving. Almost. She started asking him specific questions. Not personal. Exactly, she wasn't trying to pry into his life. More like tests. Little structural questions designed to see where the frame was. What kind of business, she asked. One Wednesday in the 3rd week of shirt fittings. Several kinds, he said. Real estate? Some of both. Marlowe. She pretended to consider the name. I don't recognize it from the financial news. His expression did not change. We don't publicize. Family business? Inherited. A brief pause. The structure was already in place when I took it over. What kind of structure? He looked at her for a moment. Not uncomfortable, he did not appear to experience discomfort the way ordinary people did, but with the look of a man recalibrating how much to give. The kind that requires a certain amount of trust before I discuss it. Claire nodded slowly. That's fair. She did not push. But she remembered the answer, and she filed the shape of it away. The fifth time Vincent came to the atelier was not for a fitting. At 6:30, the staff had largely gone, and Claire was in the workroom with the notebooks spread across her secondary table, which was something she had never done before, had never risked. But she'd stayed late to re-examine a draping problem she'd been thinking about for 3 days and had simply forgotten herself. She heard him at the door and swept the notebooks toward the back of the table with one arm. Not fast enough. He was already in the doorway. He looked at the notebooks. Then at her. Then he walked to the table before she could find a reason to stop him, and he picked up the one she hadn't managed to close, and he opened it. Claire stood absolutely still. The silence had a different quality from all the silences that had come before. This one had weight. It had the specific pressure of exposure, the feeling of having a door opened in your chest that you had not consented to open. He turned pages slowly. He did not look at her. He looked at the sketches, the way he looked at everything with that complete, unhurried attention, reading every line, as if it had something specific to tell him that he didn't want to miss. He reached the last page and stopped. He closed the notebook carefully and set it down. Then he looked at her. These shouldn't be hidden in a locker, he said. They're in a workroom, she said. You know what I mean? She did know. That was the problem. She crossed her arms, which was not something she typically did. It was the body language of a woman creating a barrier she did not have another tool to create. They're ideas, she said. They're not ideas. His voice was even, but something underneath it had shifted. They're designs. Finished ones. Some of them are better than anything this firm has put in a showroom in the last 2 years. He paused. I've seen the showroom. You're not a fashion critic. I'm someone who knows what quality looks like and can tell the difference between it and the performance of quality. He held her gaze. There's a difference. You know there's a difference. That's why you're still here at 6:30 hiding notebooks instead of sitting in a design studio upstairs. Claire felt her jaw tighten. You don't know why I'm here at 6:30, she said. Tell me. She did not want to tell him. She wanted him to stop looking at her with that direct, undeflectable attention that made the story she told herself about her situation feel suddenly fragile and small. She was here because she was building something. She was here because she was patient. She was here because she had a plan, even if the plan was mostly faith held at arm's length. But she stood in the empty workroom and she looked at the notebook she'd spent 8 years filling, and she told him the truth. Not all of it, but enough. She told him about the 36 applications. She told him about the interviews that ended without reasons. She told him about the scholarship and the institute, and the slow, grinding realization that talent was not the primary currency in the world she was trying to enter. She told him about the notebook being the only place she had allowed herself to want things without editing them first. She did not tell him about the gala. She did not tell him about Preston Caldwell. She was not ready to give him that. When she finished, the workroom was quiet. The traffic sound from the street below seemed very distant. I need to ask you something, Vincent said, and I need you to hear it as a genuine question, not a transaction. She waited. Would you be willing to work on something outside the firm? A design project. I have a context where it would be appropriate, and I would cover the costs. He paused. No firm involvement. No splitting of any outcome. Something that belongs entirely to you. Claire looked at him for a long time. What context, she said. I host private events. The people who attend them pay attention to details. The right person were presenting work in that environment. He stopped. It's one avenue. There are others. What do you get out of it, she said. The question was blunter than he'd probably expected. She could see it in the slight recalibration of his posture, the adjustment of a man who was not often asked to account for his motives. I get to see those notebooks taken seriously, he said, which is something I think should happen. That's not an answer. Pause, a real one, not a strategic one. No, he said. It isn't. He looked at the notebooks, then back at her. I find you interesting, Claire. That's honest. I'd like to continue to know you in a context that isn't a fitting room. He let that sit for a moment. The design offer stands separately from that. It isn't a condition of anything. Claire uncrossed her arms. She picked up the notebook he had set down and held it for a moment, feeling the worn cover under her fingers. She had $43 in her checking account 3 weeks ago. She still had less than $200. She had been in this building for 4 years, and her name was on nothing. Tell me what you actually do, she said. Not the edited version. I've been getting the edited version for a month. The silence that followed was the longest one yet. Vincent Marlowe looked at Claire Whitmore in the fluorescent light of a workroom at 6:30 on a Wednesday evening, and she watched him make a decision she would later understand he had never made with anyone this quickly. He told her. Not everything she would learn that full truth arrived in layers with a man like him, and that was simply the nature of a life constructed from necessary compartments. But he told her the core of it. He told her that the legitimate companies were real and profitable and entirely legal. He told her that they existed alongside other operations, older structures, inherited ones, things that did not exist on any business registry, that moved through the city in channels she would not see in any financial news because they were specifically designed to remain invisible. He told her that his family had been a specific kind of organization for 3 generations, that he had inherited both the assets and the obligations, that the power he moved with in certain rooms was not the power of money, or not only that. Claire stood with the notebook in her hands and listened. She did not run. She did not reach for her phone. She did not perform the reaction that the information arguably warranted. She was silent for a long time. Why are you telling me this? She finally said. Because you asked. Plenty of people have asked you things you didn't answer. Yes, he said. She looked at him. You're telling me because you want me to trust you. I'm telling you because you would have found out anyway, he said. You pay attention. You ask the right questions and you remember the answers. You would have put it together eventually, and I'd rather you hear it directly. He held her gaze. And yes, I want you to trust me. Those 2 things aren't mutually exclusive. She set the notebook down on the table. I need to think, she said. That's reasonable. I'm not going to give you an answer tonight. I'm not asking for one. She looked at him for a moment, this man she had been watching for a month, this man with his controlled stillness and his dark eyes, and his 3-generation criminal inheritance, who had sat in her client chair and watched her work, and listened to her speak about herself without flinching. I'll call you, she said. In a few days, he nodded. He picked up his coat from the chair where he'd left it. He moved toward the door and stopped, and she knew he was going to say something, and she waited. The notebooks are very good, he said. In case that wasn't clear. He left. Claire stood alone in the workroom. The fluorescent lights hummed above her. The notebooks lay spread across the secondary table, 8 years of wanting things she had been afraid to admit she wanted. She stood there for a long time without moving. She called him 4 days later. She did not say yes to the design project in that call. She said she had questions. He said he would answer them. She said she wanted to meet somewhere that was not the atelier. He said he knew a place. They met on a Saturday morning at a coffee counter in the West Village, small, unglamorous, the kind of place selected by someone who understood that a low-key location was its own kind of message. They sat across from each other for 2 hours, and she asked every question she had accumulated in 4 days of thinking, and he answered each one with the specific quality of a man who had decided that honesty was the only viable strategy with this particular person. She asked about the operations. He explained their general shape without operational detail, enough to confirm what he'd told her in the workroom, not enough to make her complicit in anything specific. She asked about risk. He was candid. His life carried danger that was structurally unavoidable, and lying to her about its existence would be both insulting and pointless. She asked about why her specifically, and he told her the same thing he'd said in the workroom. She was interesting, and the notebooks were genuinely good, and he was in the unusual position of being able to do something about both facts simultaneously. She studied him across the coffee counter. "You're used to people being afraid of you," she said. "Most people, yes. That doesn't bother you?" "It's useful," he said. "Doesn't satisfy anything in particular, but it's useful." "Does it bother you that I'm not?" He looked at her steadily. "No," he said. "It's the most interesting thing that's happened to me in a long time." Claire drank her coffee. She thought about the workroom. She thought about the notebook. She thought about what her mother would say. And then she thought about how her mother had worked double shifts her entire adult life and ended up with hands that ached in cold weather, and how admirable that was. And how desperately she wanted a different story without being sure she deserved one. "I'll do the project," she said, "on my conditions." "Tell me the conditions." "The work is mine. I present it. My name is on it. Every decision about it is mine. You fund the materials and the venue, and you step back." "Agreed. And this," she gestured between them, careful to keep her voice level, "whatever this is, moves at a pace I set." "Not you," he met her eyes. "Agreed. If I say stop, it stops." "Yes." She put her coffee cup down. She did not say she trusted him. She was not there yet, and she was honest enough with herself to know it. What she said was true, and it was also insufficient, but it was what she had. "Then let's start," she said. And outside, 2 floors up, in the apartment, Vincent kept above the coffee counter a fact she would not learn for another 3 weeks. A phone rang, and was not answered. Because the man who owned it was sitting across a small table, watching a woman with a worn notebook and $43 in her account decide to stop waiting for a door to open and build her own instead. The project took 6 weeks to build from nothing. Claire had done larger things with less, which was the only reason she didn't collapse in the first week, when she realized how much she had underestimated the distance between having ideas in a notebook and executing them in physical form. With a deadline and a real venue and a man, she barely knew funding all of it from somewhere she was deliberately not asking too many questions about. She worked on the pieces at night after her hours at the firm. Vincent had arranged a small studio space, a rented workroom in a building in Chelsea. Nothing remarkable. The kind of anonymous commercial space that existed in large cities, for the specific purpose of being used without being noticed. It had good light, which was what she needed, and a cutting table, long enough for her purposes, and she arrived there at 7:30 most evenings, and stayed until 11 or midnight, or twice, until 2 in the morning, when she lost track entirely. She was building 6 pieces: a structured coat, 2 dresses, a jacket, a skirt with a complex pleated panel at the back that had lived in her notebook for 3 years, and a blouse that was the simplest of the 6 and the one she cared about most. It's because simplicity is the hardest thing to get right, and she had been thinking about its particular construction for so long that getting it wrong would be more painful than failing at any of the more ambitious pieces. Vincent came to the studio on 3 occasions during the 6 weeks. He did not hover. He appeared, looked at whatever was on the table, asked 1 or 2 questions that were always precise rather than general, and left. He brought coffee on the second visit without being asked or commented on. She drank it without commenting either. She was discovering, a man who communicated a great deal through what he chose not to do. Their agreement moved at the pace she set, as he had promised. He did not push. He did not manufacture situations. He called twice a week, late evening, and their conversations ran between 20 minutes and an hour, covering whatever territory presented itself: the project, the fund firm, her brother Evan's community college enrollment, the operational landscape of his various organizations, in terms abstract enough that she was receiving information without being made an accessory to anything specific. She was learning the shape of his world without being asked to enter it, and she understood this was intentional, and she was not sure whether it made her more cautious or less. Both, probably. Both simultaneously, which was an uncomfortable place to live. The event itself was a private dinner. 40 guests, a townhouse on the Upper East Side that Vincent used for business functions of the kind that did not appear on any public calendar. The guests were a specific type, the kind of wealth that had moved past the stage of displaying itself loudly and arrived at the more dangerous stage of not needing to display it at all. These were people who made decisions that affected large amounts of money and occasionally large numbers of people, and they ate dinner together periodically in private rooms and called it business. Claire understood she was not being invited to this dinner as a guest. She was presenting work in a context where the work would be seen by exactly the people who had the power to make it mean something. She understood this was a gift in the particular way that things given by powerful people are gifts freely offered and not without cost, even if the nature of the cost wasn't yet fully visible. She went anyway. She went because the 6 pieces were good, and she knew they were good, and she had spent too long in a workroom making other people's work visible to spend one more day keeping her own work invisible out of principle. She wore the emerald dress. She had built it in the 4th week of the project, not originally part of the 6, but she had been working late and tired, and slightly reckless in the way that exhaustion sometimes produces. And she had cut it in 2 hours from a bolt of silk crepe she'd purchased with her own money, not the project budget, because it felt like something that should be entirely hers. She had draped it directly on her dress form, without a pattern, which was not how it typically worked, and it had come out better than most things she planned carefully. Color was deep and clear, and the cut did something at the shoulder that she had never seen anyone else do, a slight structural reinforcement that allowed the fabric to move correctly without losing its shape. She put it on the evening of dinner and stood in front of the mirror in her apartment bathroom, which was the only full-length mirror she owned, and she looked at herself for a long moment. She looked like the person she had been trying to become. Not the finished version, not the arrived version, but the true direction of the thing, visible and undeniable. She took the subway to the Upper East Side. The townhouse was the kind of building that announced wealth through restraint, no ornamentation, a clean limestone facade. The heavy front door answered by a man in a dark suit who was not, she was fairly certain, primarily employed as a doorman. He confirmed her name against a list, and she was shown through an entry hall and into a reception space where approximately 20 of the 40 guests had already arrived. She recognized no one immediately. She had not expected to. What she had not expected was the moment she stepped into the room, and the particular social mechanism of a room of powerful people registered her presence and made its automatic assessment, her dress, her face, the way she moved through a doorway, and found something in that assessment that was not dismissal. She felt it the same way she always felt these evaluations, the ambient social sonar of a room processing a new element, and what came back was not the particular silence of the gala. What came back was something more like attention. She found Vincent across the room. He was in conversation with 2 men in their 60s, relaxed in the way that people are only relaxed when they are the most powerful presence in their immediate vicinity. He saw her. His expression did not dramatically change. That was not his register. But something in his posture shifted by a degree or two, and he excused himself from the conversation with an ease that suggested the conversation would have continued indefinitely on its own without him. He crossed the room to her. "The dress is yours," he said. "Obviously. It's exceptional." "I know," she said. She was not being arrogant. She was being honest, which she had learned was its own skill and one she was still practicing. He stood beside her then and began quietly, making introductions, not steering her, not positioning her, but providing names and brief contexts so that she could navigate the room herself rather than being navigated. A woman named Adeze, who ran an investment fund and had appeared on the covers of 3 magazines Claire had studied in school. A man named Bertram, who owned department stores in 4 cities. A gallery owner. An architect. A woman in a steel gray suit who did something in private equity that was left deliberately vague. Claire shook hands. She made conversation. She was direct and clear in the way she always was, and in this room, unlike the gala, unlike the Hawthorne and Vale hierarchy, her directness seemed to register as confidence rather than deficiency. These were people who spent most of their time being managed and positioned by people who wanted things from them. Someone who spoke plainly and without agenda was, in this context, something of a relief, Dinner was served at a long table in the dining room. Claire was seated to Vincent's left. She was aware of this placement and what it communicated to the room without being asked to communicate it. And she made a note of this awareness, and she made a note to put it aside, rather than letting it become noise while she was trying to manage 12 other things simultaneously. The presentations of work were scheduled between courses, which was Vincent's arrangement brief, informal, conversation starters rather than formal pitches. Claire had 3 pieces on a rolling rack just outside the dining room. She had not prepared a speech. She had prepared for questions. She was introduced by Vincent with exactly 3 sentences. Then the rack was brought in. She stood beside the work and she talked about it. Not a performance. Just what she had actually been thinking when she built each piece, the structural problems she'd identified and how she'd resolved them, the specific choices that were choices and not accidents. She spoke for about 8 minutes, and then there were questions, and she answered them for another 12. She was good at this. She discovered she was good at it in real time, which was a particular kind of surprise, the discovery that a skill you thought was only theoretical is actually operational when the moment arrives. Adizi asked about her material sourcing. Bertram asked about scale, whether the construction methods were adaptable to production quantities or exclusively artisanal. A man at the far end of the table asked about her background in a way that was genuine rather than dismissive, and she told him the short version: scholarship, institute, 4 years in a workroom, these 6 pieces. The room's quality of attention told her something was happening. She was collecting business cards. People were approaching her between the following courses, while she was drinking water and trying to process what was occurring, and they were handing her cards and saying the specific things that people in this world say when they are actually interested, rather than performing interest. She was standing near the end of the rack, straightening the skirt onto its hanger for the 4th time, because she needed something to do with her hands, when the dining room door opened and a late arrival was shown through. She heard the room's social register shift before she turned. The particular movement of attention that happens when someone enters who carries the specific weight that changes a room's gravity. She turned. Preston Caldwell stood in the doorway. He wore a navy suit, open collar, the expression of a man who had been late to enough important events to have stopped being apologetic about it. He was scanning the room with the comfortable authority of someone who had been in rooms like this his entire life and expected to know most of the people in them. His scan reached Claire. It stopped. She watched the recognition move across his face, not immediate, a half-second delay, because she was not in the context his brain had filed her in, not in the category of people who appeared in rooms like this. But then it arrived, and she watched him recalibrate, and she watched the recalibration fail to produce a coherent result, because there was no file in his system for this. Claire did not move. She held the hanger of the pleated skirt in her left hand, and she stood in Vincent Marlowe's dining room in her own emerald dress, and she looked at Preston Caldwell with an expression that was entirely level. Preston's recovery was faster than she gave him credit for. He arranged his face into something approximating normalcy and moved toward the table. He spoke to Vincent with the slightly too smooth ease of a man who needed something and was practiced at obscuring the need. She caught fragments: Caldwell development, a proposal, an investment context. She understood in broad terms what was happening. Preston was here. Bika was here to ask for money, which meant the Caldwell family's position was not what his social confidence suggested. And this information settled somewhere in Claire's chest, with a weight she did not immediately want to examine. She was placed back at the table for the final course. So was Preston at the opposite end. He looked at her twice during the meal. The first time she met his eyes, and he looked away. The second time she was already looking somewhere else. The dinner ended. The guests moved back to the reception space for a final drink. Claire was in conversation with Bertram about production-scale questions when she felt the particular quality of Preston Caldwell arriving in her vicinity, that ambient awareness of a person you cannot stop tracking even when you're not looking at them. Ms. Whitmore, was it? She turned. He was close enough to require her to look up slightly, which she suspected was deliberate. "Yes," she said. "Preston Caldwell." He offered his hand. She shook it. "Your work is impressive," he said. The compliment was real but thin, the compliment of a man who was genuinely impressed and did not enjoy being impressed by someone he had categorized as not warranting it. "Thank you. You're connected to this house through Vincent?" The question was wrapped in casual curiosity, but underneath it was something with a sharper edge, an attempt to map the nature of her presence, to understand whether she was a client or a professional associate or something else, because the category would determine how he was required to treat her going forward. "We work together," she said, deliberately imprecise. Something behind Preston's eyes recalibrated. He was looking at her dress, not rudely but automatically, and she could see him doing the structural math, the quality of the construction, the cut, nothing he had a category for in his assessment of who she was. "You made that," he said. "It was not a question." "I make everything I wear," she said. A beat. "You were at the Hadley Foundation Gala," he said so. "A few months ago." "I was." He looked at her and she looked at him, and the specific history of that evening hung between them like smoke present, unignorable, and she was not going to be the one to reach out and try to clear it. "I may have been," he started. "You were," she said. Her voice was flat, not angry, just accurate. He stopped. "The gala was not my finest moment," he said. It was the closest he was capable of getting to an apology, and they both knew it. "No," she agreed. "It wasn't." She excused herself from the conversation by turning to Adeze, who had reappeared at her left, and picking up a thread of the earlier discussion about material sourcing, as though Preston Caldwell had already ceased to exist as a relevant presence. She did not look at him again that evening, but she was aware, through the rest of the night, of something having shifted inside her, not in the direction of satisfaction exactly, which surprised her. She had imagined in the abstract that seeing Preston Caldwell in a context where she held the position and he was the one trying to recover his footing would feel like something resolved. What she actually felt was more complicated than that, more uncomfortable. She felt the beginning of something she didn't have a clean name for yet. Vincent walked her out at 11. Not formally, not as a gesture, he simply appeared as she was gathering her coat and walked with her to the front door, and they stood on the top step of the townhouse in the November air while she waited for the car he'd arranged. "Caldwell," she said. "He's been trying to get a meeting for 6 weeks," Vincent said. "His family's development group has financing problems. Significant ones." "How significant?" "The kind that don't have a lot of solutions." He looked at the street. "He came here because he thought this was one of the remaining ones." Claire was quiet for a moment. "Did you know he'd be here tonight?" she said. The pause that followed was brief, but she was paying enough attention to feel its weight. "I knew he'd been requesting a meeting," Vincent said. "I didn't specifically arrange for tonight to be when that meeting happened." "But you did not arrange it," she said. Another pause. Different texture. This one held something that was not quite admission and not quite deflection. "He would have encountered you eventually," Vincent said. "In some context, given what you're building. That's not what I asked." "No," he said, "it isn't." The car appeared at the end of the block. Claire picked up the bag she'd brought, the notebook, always the notebook, and held it against her side. "The evening was real," she said. It was not a question. It was something she was establishing for herself out loud. Something she needed to have stated in the air between them. The introductions, the connections, the work that was real. It wasn't staged for his benefit. The evening was real, Vincent said. What you accomplished tonight was real. I wouldn't waste your work as a prop in someone else's narrative. She believed him. She also understood that this was not the same as understanding everything that had been arranged and why, and that those were two different things that could both be true simultaneously. The car stopped at the curb. "I need you to promise me something," she said. "Can. The things you do, I don't need to know the details. We've established that. But if something you're managing is going to intersect with my life, I need to know beforehand. Not after. Not in the moment." She met his eyes. "I can't be surprised. I can work with complicated. I can't work with blind." Vincent looked at her for a moment. The specific look of a man who was accustomed to being the only one in the room with a complete map. Agreed, he said. She got in the car. She was halfway back to Brooklyn when her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Evan. At 11:20 on a Thursday night. She answered. Hey. His voice was wrong. She knew her brother's voice in all its registers, and this one's slightly too controlled, slightly too even, was the one he used when he was trying not to sound like something was wrong. What happened? She said. Nothing. Can you call me tomorrow? It's not. Evan, a long pause. I lost the warehouse job, he said. When 3 weeks ago, she sat very still in the car. 3 weeks, she said. I didn't want to tell you when you were doing the project thing. You had enough? What happened? He told her. A supervisor issue that had escalated and then culminated in a way that was partly Evan's fault and partly not. The details came in fragments, incomplete. His voice dropping at the places where his own part in it was harder to explain. He hadn't been showing up consistently for the last 2 months. His attendance at the community college classes had also become irregular. He owed his landlord $600. Claire pressed the back of her head against the car seat and stared at the ceiling. Where are you sleeping? She said. My apartment. I'm still Marcus is letting me slide on the rent until $600? $640. She closed her eyes. She had $720 in her account. Most of it was going to go to her own rent in 11 days. The project had covered its own materials and venue, not her living costs, and her Hawthorne Anvil paycheck had been paying her survival margin for 4 years and would not expand because she needed it to. I'll call you tomorrow morning, she said. Don't do anything else until I call you. Claire, you don't have to. I'll call you tomorrow, she said again, and she ended the call, a sound like green wood splitting, and she sat in the back of Vincent Marlowe's car with $720, and a brother who had been drowning for 3 weeks without telling her, and she stared at the ceiling and felt the specific quality of a life that is going well in one direction, simultaneously unraveling in another. She did not tell Vincent that night. She told him 4 days later, because she needed those 4 days to figure out what she was actually asking for and what she was not. She was not asking for his money. She established this first clearly, before anything else. Evan is my problem, she said. They were in the Chelsea studio, and she had the coat on the dress form and was supposed to be adding a final button treatment, but had been standing in front of it for 20 minutes without touching it. I'm not telling you because I want you to fix it. Then why are you telling me? She picked up the needle. Because you told me you wanted honesty. Because there are going to be times when something in my life is complicated, and I'm going to be in a bad mood and working through something, and I'd rather you know the shape of what it is than you making guesses. Okay, he said. That's it? Okay. What did you expect me to say? She looked at him. I expected you to try to solve it. Do you want me to try to solve it? No, then I won't. She turned back to the coat. Her hands found the button placement, and she began working, and the silence settled into the room with its familiar weight, and she worked. He did not offer to fix Evan's situation that evening. He called her 2 days later with a name, a logistics company that was hiring, entry-level operations coordinator. No prior experience required, but good attendance and reliability emphasized. The kind of stable employment that would give Evan structure if Evan was willing to step into structure. You said you weren't going to solve it, Claire said. I provided a phone number, he said. What Evan does with it is his. She understood a careful distinction. She also understood it was Vincent's particular way of respecting the line she'd drawn while doing what he was constitutionally built to do, which was remove obstacles from situations he cared about. She gave Evan the number. Evan called. He got an interview for the following week. This was the world she was learning. With a man like Vincent, you set the boundaries of what you would accept, and he navigated precisely up to them, and no further, and this required a clarity about what you would and would not accept that she had never had to apply this rigorously to any relationship before. It was exhausting. It was also, beginning to understand, a form of respect she had not been offered often enough to immediately recognize it. 3 weeks after the dinner, Adese's office called the Atelier, asking for Claire Whitmore's contact information. Claire received this message as a folded note from the front desk, delivered to the workroom by a junior assistant who looked faintly puzzled by the request. She called back from the workroom phone during her lunch break. Adaisy's assistant said that Miss Adays was interested in commissioning 2 pieces for the following spring, and that she would also like to speak with Claire directly about a potential introduction to a buyer she knew at a department store in Chicago. Claire held the phone for a moment after the call ended. Then she placed it back in its cradle and stood with her hands flat on the workroom table and breathed. Something was beginning. She could feel it the way she could feel incorrect tension in a shoulder seam before she could see it clearly in her hands in some register below conscious thought. What she did not feel, not yet, not even in that register, was what was also beginning 3 blocks away, in a law office, where a conversation was happening that had her name in it and her relationship with Vincent Marlowe as its subject, and which would, in 11 days, put everything she had started building in direct and total jeopardy. She picked up her needle and went back to work. The call came on a Tuesday morning to her workroom phone, from a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer. She was in the middle of a seam, and answering mid-seam required an interruption in concentration that cost her more than other people understood. She answered. The man on the other end of the line identified himself as Raymond Chu, and he was an attorney, and he represented a group of individuals who had significant concerns about the Marlowe organization's recent activities, and he was calling because Claire Whitmore's name had appeared in documents relevant to those concerns, and he believed she would want to know that before those documents became part of a formal proceeding. Claire set down her needle. "What documents?" she said. Raymond chewed in the careful language of a man who chose each word as though words were tools he used with precision, a set of financial records. Records that showed material transfers, funding for a studio space, material purchases, a venue hire originating from a Marlowe organization account, and moving into operational expenses associated with a design project bearing Claire Whitmore's name. She understood what he was describing. Those were legitimate business expenses, she said. Investment in a project. The account those funds originated from, Chu said, is currently the subject of a federal investigation into money laundering. The workroom was very quiet. The transactions are dated, he continued. They are substantial enough to constitute evidence of knowing financial relationship. And Ms. Whitmore, the people conducting this investigation, are not primarily interested in you. They are interested in Mr. Marlowe, but they are interested in everyone connected to him, and at the moment you are connected to him in ways that are very visible in these documents. Claire's hand was on the work table. She could feel the grain of the wood under her palm. "What do you want?" she said. "My clients want information," he said. "They want to understand the operational structure of the Marlowe organization. You have been in close relationship with Vincent Marlowe for approximately 3 months. You have been in his professional spaces, his private events, his confidence. They believe you have information that would be useful. And if I don't cooperate, then the documents I've described become part of a record that will be difficult to explain," he said. "The project funding, the venue, the materials on paper, Miss Whitmore, it looks like you were compensated for participation in activity you understood the nature of." "That's not what it was." "I understand that," he said. "My clients also understand that. They're not interested in prosecuting a seamstress. They are interested in Marlowe. What I'm suggesting is that the distinction between those 2 outcomes depends significantly on what you choose to do next." Claire sat very still for a long time. The sewing machine at the far end of the workroom was still running. She'd left it on, and its small, mechanical rhythm was the only sound in the room. "I'll need time," she said. "You have 48 hours, said Raymond Chu. After that, the documents filed themselves. He gave her a number and ended the call. Claire sat with the phone in her hand long after the call was over. She thought about the 6 pieces on the rolling rack at the Chelsea studio. She thought about Adaisy's business card in her wallet. She thought about the notebook, about 8 years of wanting things she had been afraid to want, about the first night in the coffee counter when she had said, "Let's start," and felt the ground shift beneath her in a way that felt like beginning rather than falling. She thought about Vincent, who had told her he would answer honestly and had answered as honestly as a man in his position could answer, and who had also arranged, or not unarranged, for Preston Caldwell to be in that dining room on an evening that changed the trajectory of her work. She thought about 48 hours. She put the phone down and picked up her needle, and she finished the seam she had started, because she did not know what else to do with her hands, and her hands had never let her down the way the rest of her life currently seemed intent on doing. And she worked the needle through the fabric with steady, careful strokes, and she did not cry. And she did not call Vincent. And she sat in the truth of a situation that had no clean exits and tried to understand which version of herself she was going to have to become in order to survive it. Claire did not sleep that night. She lay in her apartment with the ceiling above her and the city outside making its low, indifferent noise, and she ran the conversation with Raymond Chu through her mind the way she ran her fingers over a seam she suspected was wrong methodically. From every angle, looking for the structural failure that would tell her what was actually broken and what was only appearing to be. She did not call Vincent. This was the first decision she made, and she made it within 20 minutes of hanging up the workroom phone. Not because she didn't trust him. Trust was a more complicated instrument than that at this point, but because she needed to understand what she actually knew before she handed it to someone else to interpret. Vincent was extraordinary at interpreting situations in his favor. That was how he had survived, and she needed first to understand the situation without his interpretation layered over it. What she knew, the studio space, the materials, the venue heir. 3 line items on a Marlowe organization account that a federal investigation had already found and flagged. She had not known the account's origin or status. She had not asked. That had felt like a reasonable boundary at the time, the distance she'd agreed to maintain from the specifics of his business, and now that same distance was the thing that made her look, on paper, like she had known and chosen not to ask. There was a significant difference between those two things. The difference was not visible in a document. Raymond Chu's clients wanted information about the Marlowe organization structure. They wanted it from her because they believed she had it. Question was how much she actually had, and whether what she had was the kind that could be extracted without destroying both herself and Vincent in the process. She stared at the ceiling until 4 a.m. Then she got up, made coffee, and called her brother. Evan answered on the second ring, which meant he hadn't been sleeping either, which was a separate problem she filed away for later. "I need you to do something for me," she said. "It's 4 a.m. I know, I need you to listen first." She sat at her kitchen table with both hands around the coffee cup. "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to not react until I'm finished," told him. Not everything. She did not tell him the specific nature of what Raymond Chu had described, because pulling Evan into the legal perimeter of this situation was the last thing she was willing to do. But she told him enough, that she had built something with funding she had not fully investigated, that there were people now using that fact as leverage, that she was trying to figure out what her options actually were before they ran out. Evan was quiet for a long time. "How much time do you have?" he said. 48 hours from yesterday morning, so like 36 hours now. Approximately another silence. "This Vincent guy," Evan said. His voice had a careful quality, the voice of a 20-year-old trying to respond to information well beyond his experience with the dignity of someone older. "Does he know Chu called you?" "Not yet." "Are you going to tell him?" "Yes," she said. "I have to. I just needed to think first." "What's there to think about? Either you cooperate with Chu or you don't. Either you tell Vincent or you don't." He paused. "What's actually keeping you up?" Claire looked at her coffee. The question was simple enough that it was almost brutal. "I don't know which version of this I can live with," she said. "That's what's keeping me up." She called Vincent at 7:15 in the morning. He answered before the second ring. "I need to see you," she said. "Today?" "Not at the atelier, where?" "Not a question exactly." "An opening, the coffee counter," she said. "An hour." She was there in 40 minutes. She ordered nothing, sat in the same seat as the first time, and waited with her hands flat on the table. Her eyes were raw from no sleep, and the specific kind of strain that accumulates when your body has been running on adrenaline for 12 hours, and the adrenaline is starting to metabolize into something closer to fear. Vincent arrived exactly on time. He looked at her face when he came through the door, and something sharpened in him. She saw it. The way an already alert animal becomes more alert when something in the immediate environment changes, and he crossed to the table and sat down and said nothing. Waiting, she told him about Raymond Chu. She told him everything. In the same methodical way, she ran her fingers over a broken seam, from the beginning of the call to the end, verbatim, as much as she could reconstruct, without editorializing. She watched his face while she spoke. His face was very still. The stillness was not blankness. It was the concentrated control of a man absorbing information he had not anticipated and was in the process of integrating. When she finished, the silence lasted about 8 seconds. "Who is Raymond Chu representing?" he said. His voice was entirely level. He didn't say, he said clients, plural. He said they were primarily interested in the organization's structure, not in me. "He wouldn't have a name you'd recognize," Vincent said. It was not quite to her. He was thinking aloud, which she had never seen him do before the usually sealed internal process, slightly visible like a seam allowance caught in the light. "This is internal." She felt the words land before she fully processed them. "What does internal mean?" she said. He looked at her. A long look, the look of a man deciding how much of a map to hand over. "It means the people who want information about organization structure are not outside the organization," he said. The workroom ceiling seemed very far above her suddenly. "Someone inside your operation," she said. "Someone who knows enough to identify the specific accounts connected to your project," he said, "and who calculated that you were the right point of pressure." He was looking at her steadily. "Because you're connected enough to be useful, and knew enough that they assumed you'd be afraid." "I am afraid," she said. "I know." He did not say it dismissively. He said it the way you say something true. "You going to cooperate with Chu?" She looked at him across the table. "What information would I even give them? I don't know operational details. I know the shape of what you do, not the inside of it." "The shape is enough," he said. "In the right hands, with the right existing information, the shape is enough to complete a picture." "Then I don't have much to negotiate with," she said. "If I cooperate, I give them a partial picture that may or may not be what they need. If I don't cooperate, the documents go forward and I spend the next several years explaining to federal investigators why I accepted funding from an account under investigation." "That's the correct summary," he said. "That's a terrible summary," she said. "That's a summary where neither option is survivable." "One option is survivable," he said. "We find who inside the organization is running Chu. We find them before your 48 hours expire. And we give the federal investigators something significantly larger than a seamstress's project budget." She stared at him. "You're going to give up someone in your own organization. I'm going to give up someone who is actively working to destroy it from the inside," he said. His voice had an edge to it now controlled, but audible, the edge of a man whose particular form of anger was extremely quiet and extremely focused. "That's not loyalty. That's surgery." She sat with this for a moment. "Who do you think it is?" she said. He looked at her for a moment, and she could see him making a decision. "I have a name," he said. "I've had a suspicion for 6 weeks. This confirms the shape of it." "Who?" "His name is Daniel Reeves," Vincent said. "He's been with the organization for 11 years. He manages the account structures. He would know which specific accounts were associated with your project. And he would know that making that connection visible was the most efficient way to create pressure on me without directly confronting the operational side." "Why would he want to create pressure on you?" "Because I declined a proposal he brought me 4 months ago," Vincent said. "An expansion of certain operations into a territory I decided wasn't worth the exposure. It cost him a significant amount of potential income. And Daniel Reeves is not a man who accepts financial losses with equanimity." Claire pressed both palms flat on the table. "So he used me," she said. "He used the most visible new element in my life," Vincent said. "Yes." She felt something move through her that was not quite anger, and not quite grief, the particular feeling of understanding that you have been handled. That someone looked at the landscape of your life and identified you as a lever. That your notebooks and your 6 pieces and your 48 hours of exposed vulnerability were, to a man named Daniel Reeves, simply geometry. "I need you to tell me something," she said. Her voice was very steady. "And I need the honest answer, not the managed one. Go ahead. Is there any version of this where I come out the other side with what I've been building still intact? The connections from the dinner. D's, the work, any version?" He looked at her for a long time. "Yes," he said. "But it requires you to trust me completely for approximately the next 24 hours. Not partially, not with conditions. Completely. I trusted you with conditions from the beginning," she said. "You agreed to those conditions." "I know," he said. "I'm asking you to change the terms. Temporarily. Because what I need to do in the next 24 hours is not something I can do on a partial mandate." She looked at him across the small table in the West Village coffee counter where they had first agreed to begin something, and she ran the numbers on every version of what came next. "Tell me what you're going to do," she said. "All of it," he told her. It took 20 minutes, and it was the most complete picture of the inside of his operation she had yet received, and she sat across from him and listened and did not look away. When he was finished, she said, "If this goes wrong, I lose everything." "Yes," he said. "And if I try to manage it alone, I also lose everything." "Yes," he said. "That's not actually a choice," she said. "No," he said. "It isn't." She picked up the coffee she hadn't ordered, that had appeared in front of her at some point during the conversation without her noticing, placed there by someone Vincent had apparently made a gesture to while she was talking. She drank. 24 hours, she said. 24 hours, he said. "And then I want full transparency. Not shape. Detail." "Agreed. And Daniel Reeves doesn't get to be the only consequence," she said. "I want Preston Caldwell's financing situation resolved in a way that has nothing to do with Vincent Marlowe's mercy. I want that to be about his own decisions, not your power. You don't get to make that part of whatever deal you're constructing." He looked at her with something that was not quite surprise. Something more like the expression of a man who has underestimated an instrument and is in the process of revising that assessment upward. "That's not connected to Reeves," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm telling you anyway, because I can feel you thinking about it." He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. She stood up and picked up her bag. 24 hours, she said. "Call me when it's done." She left. She went to the Chelsea studio because she had nowhere else to go that made sense. She went there and she stood in front of the dress form with the coat on it, and she looked at it for a long time. Then she sat down at the cutting table and she opened the notebook to a clean page and she began to sketch. Not because she was calm. She was not calm. Her hands had a slight tremor in them that she managed by gripping the pencil harder than necessary, and her breathing was the specific shallow kind of breathing that happens when your body is managing fear through control rather than release. She sketched because it was the thing she did when everything else was beyond her control. Because fabric and line and form were the one domain where the rules were honest, where what you put in was what you got out, where there was no geometry she couldn't eventually solve if she was patient enough and kept her hand steady. She sketched for 2 hours. Then she called Adegise. Not to explain anything, not to manage the situation in advance. She called because Adesi had left her a message about the Chicago buyer introduction, and she had not returned it. A sound like green wood splitting and maintaining the connections from the dinner required her to behave like a professional, even on the days when behaving like a professional required everything she had. She left a message. She was sorry for the delay. She was available Thursday for a call. She was looking forward to the introduction. She hung up and stared at her phone. Then it rang. Unknown number. Different from Chu's. She answered, "Miss Whitmore." A man's voice, not Chu's. Wheater. The voice of a man who did not need volume to convey authority. "My name is Leonard Marsh. I'm a special agent with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. I wonder if you'd be available to come in for a voluntary conversation this afternoon." Pencil was still in her hand. She set it down. "Voluntary," she said. "At this stage, yes," he said. We'd like to speak with you about your involvement in certain financial activity associated with the Marlowe organization. Raymond Chu had said 48 hours. It had been 18. Am I being compelled? She said. Not at this stage, Marsh said. We'd simply like to talk. I'd like to speak to an attorney before I come in, she said. That's your right, absolutely, he said. Of course. She ended the call. She sat for approximately 30 seconds. Then she called Vincent. He answered on the first ring. They moved, she said. Federal agent, Leonard Marsh. He wants a voluntary interview today. Silence is on his end. 2 seconds 3. The specific silence of a man doing very fast calculations. Don't go in, he said. Not today. You have the right to delay. Get an attorney. I have a name. I'm not taking your attorney, she said. That creates a connection in the record. A pause. You're right. Do you have... I'll find one. I need you to accelerate whatever you're doing. The 48 hours just became less, I know, he said. I know. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard before, not panic. He was not a man who panicked, but something adjacent to urgency that he was containing through the same mechanism he contained everything. I need 3 hours. You have 2, she said. She ended the call. She found an attorney through Adize, not by calling Adize directly and explaining, but through the card Adize had given her at the dinner, which included a secondary contact. The secondary contact was a woman named Priya Kohler, who did civil litigation, not criminal, but she knew someone, and that someone called Claire back in 40 minutes. His name was Franklin Cole, and he was 61 years old, and he had a voice like quarry stone. And when she explained the situation in compressed, accurate terms, he said, "Don't say anything to anyone until we speak in person. I can be available at 3. She met him at his office at 3. She told him everything except the parts that were Vincent's to decide whether to reveal. He listened without interrupting. His expression during the entire recounting was the same composed, assessing expression, a man building a structural map of a situation and checking it for load-bearing elements. The account funding is the problem, he said when she finished. Everything else is peripheral. If we can establish that you had no knowledge of the account's investigative status at the time of the transactions, and that the nature of the investment was consistent with standard business practice. It was, she said. He invested in the project. He didn't ask for anything operational in return. Can you document the terms? There was no written agreement. She watched his expression. It was verbal. He wrote something on his notepad. We're going to need to establish the nature of the relationship, comprehensively, he said. Professional context, timeline, the character of communications. We're going to need to make it very clear that you were a business contact who received investment funding, not a participant in criminal enterprise. That's exactly what I was, she said. I believe you, he said. The record needs to believe you. Those are different things. Her phone vibrated. She glanced at it. Vincent. She let it go to voicemail. Cole spent another 40 minutes preparing her. What she would and would not say if she decided to speak voluntarily. What constituted legally significant information versus background. The distinction between cooperation and self-incrimination, and how that line was navigated in practice in her specific situation. She was in the elevator, going down from his office, when she listened to Vincent's voicemail. 3 words, it's done. Reeves. She stood in the elevator lobby for a moment. Then she went back upstairs and told Cole there had been a development. She did not know at that moment exactly what Vincent had done. She learned the specific shape of it over the following 48 hours, in pieces, the way you learn most significant things, not all at once but in increments, each one adjusting the picture slightly. Daniel Reeves had been, for 18 months, providing structural information about Marlowe organization accounts to a group of competing interests who had been using it to position themselves for a hostile takeover of certain operations in the organization's territory. Raymond Chu was their attorney. The federal investigation was real but had been seeded in part by information. Reeves himself had provided feeding the investigators enough to create pressure on Vincent while keeping himself positioned on the correct side of the resulting fracture. It was sophisticated. It was patient. It was the work of someone who had been inside the organization long enough to understand exactly how it breathed and exactly where to apply pressure to interrupt that breathing. What Vincent had done in the 2 hours Claire had given him was make Reeves's operation visible to the federal investigators in a form significantly more useful to them than anything they had already assembled. He had done this through a third-party Hessen attorneys of his own, not the one he'd offered Claire, who had made initial contact Marsh's office, with documentation that reframed the investigation from the Marlowe organization outward to the network Reeves had been facilitating. When Leonard Marsh called Claire back the following morning, his tone was different. Not friendly. Federal agents in the middle of active investigations were not friendly. But the quality of the conversation had shifted from a conversation with a potential subject to a conversation with a potential witness, and those were structurally different conversations. And Claire had been briefed enough by Franklin Cole to understand the distinction when she heard it. She went in voluntarily on Thursday. Cole sat beside her. She answered the questions she could answer honestly, and referred others to Cole. It lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. Marsh was professionally courteous, in the way of someone who has received recent information that has changed the relevance of the person across the table from a tactical priority to a contextual detail. I walked of the federal building into the November afternoon and stood on the sidewalk and breathed for a long moment. Then she called her brother Evan. "Yeah, I'm okay," she said. A pause on his end.
"Yeah?"
"Yeah." She looked at the street. "The interview for the logistics job. When is it?" "Next Tuesday." "Go to it," she said. "Wear the gray shirt, not the blue one. The blue one has a fraying collar. I know about my own shirts, Claire." "The gray one," she said. He laughed slightly. "You okay? Like actually?" She thought about the Chelsea studio, the dress form, the sound with its finished button treatment, the coat with its clean pages, and the new sketches she'd made during the worst night of the past several months. "Getting there," she said. She hung up and stood on the sidewalk for another moment. Then she started walking. She walked to the Chelsea studio. It was 4:30 on a Thursday, and the light coming through the high windows was the particular low November gold that didn't last long. She didn't take off her coat. She stood in the middle of the room and looked at the 6 pieces on the rack: the coat, the 2 dresses, the jacket, the pleated skirt, the blouse. They were still good. Everything that had happened in the past 5 days had not changed the fact that the work was good. The work existed independently of Daniel Reeves's calculations and Raymond Chu's 48-hour clock and the federal building's institutional corridors and every other structure that had tried to make it peripheral. The work was still there on the rack, exactly as she had left it. Took off her coat. She sat down at the cutting table. She opened the notebook. She wasn't ready to think about the next thing. She wasn't ready to call a days back. Wasn't ready to think about Bertram's questions about production scale. Wasn't ready to map the path from where she was to where she was trying to go. That would come. She was too exhausted tonight for that to come. But she was ready to sketch. She picked up the pencil. Her phone vibrated on the table. Vincent. She looked at it for a moment. A sound like green wood splitting. Then she set it face down on the table and picked up the pencil and opened the notebook to the page she'd been working on during the worst of the previous night. She would call him back. She would have the full transparency conversation she'd demanded, and she would have it completely, and it would be difficult, and she would not let it be otherwise. Sound. There were things she needed to understand about what he had done and how, and there were things she needed to establish about what their continued relationship required from both of them. And none of those conversations were ones she was willing to have when she was running on 2 hours and post-adrenaline shaking. She would call him back tonight. She put the pencil to the page. She had been sketching for about 20 minutes when she heard the studio door. She turned. It was not Vincent. The man in the doorway was someone she had never seen before, early 50s. Unremarkable in appearance, a gray coat, the specific quality of stillness that she had come to associate with people who operated in Vincent's world. Not threatening in his posture, not visibly armed. Simply present in the doorway with the contained quality of a man who had been asked to deliver a message and was accustomed to delivering messages to people in difficult situations. "Ms. Whitmore," he said. She did not move. Her hand was still on the pencil. "My name is Graham," he said. "I work for Mr. Marlowe. He asked me to bring you something." He held up a manila envelope. She looked at it, then at him, then at the envelope again. "Put it on the table," she said. He crossed to the cutting table and set the envelope down and stepped back without being asked to. She noted this. She looked at the envelope without touching it for a moment. "Is he all right?" she said. "Mr. Marlowe is well," Graham said. "He wanted you to have that before the end of the day." She picked up the envelope. Inside was a single document, 3 pages, stapled. She read the first page. It was a transfer of ownership document for the Chelsea studio space. The property, currently leased by a Marlowe organization shell company, was being transferred to Claire Whitmore outright. The transfer was unconditional. There was a note clipped to the front page. In handwriting she recognized, now controlled, spare, no flourish. "The studio is yours. Not mine to hold, V." She read the document twice. She set it down on the table. She picked up her phone and called him. He answered immediately. "The studio," she said. "Yes." I didn't ask for this." "I know," he said. "That's why I'm giving it." She pressed her other hand flat on the cutting table and looked at the dress form in the corner with the coat on it. "We're going to have a conversation," she said. "A real one. Tonight or tomorrow. And it's going to be uncomfortable." "I know," he said. "I need to understand everything that happened in those 2 hours. I need to understand how it was done, and what it cost, and what I may be connected to as a result." "All of it tonight," he said. "I'll come to the studio." "No," she said. "The coffee counter. It started there." Pause. 7 o'clock, he said. 7 o'clock, she said. She hung up. She looked around the studio that was now legally entirely hers. The dress form, the rack, the long cutting table, the notebook, the windows with the last of the November gold finally failing, and the city lights beginning to replace it, the specific Manhattan twilight that had been in the background of every significant moment of her adult life. She looked at the pleated skirt on its hanger. She looked at her hands. She thought about who she had been when she walked into this studio 6 weeks ago, the woman who had said, "Let's start," and meant it with a part of herself, and also had no idea what starting was actually going to cost. She had been brave, but she had also been naive in the specific way of someone who understands risk in the abstract and has not yet met it in the specific. She was not that woman anymore. She didn't know yet who she was instead. That was a question for the other side of the conversation she was going to have at 7 o'clock, and for the one after that, and for all the mornings that came after this particular terrible, necessary week. But she was still here. The work was still on the rack. A sound like green wood splitting. The notebook was still open on the table, and her name was going on something, even if she had to fight through everything standing between her and the door to make it happen. And even if the person standing at that door sometimes had complicated reasons for being there, that she was still in the process of fully understanding. She picked up the pencil. She went back to work. Outside, in the last of the November dark, 3 blocks away, and moving in the direction of the coffee counter, Vincent Marlowe walked with his hands in his coat pockets, and the specific expression of an absence and the inner spent went kind where every calculation who involves who matters and the cost of every. A sound answer is not recoverable, and who was now walking toward the reckoning he had agreed to and did not intend to. And in a midtown office, Leonard Marsh sat across a table from Daniel Reeves and a team of attorneys, and the documents in front of them were very thorough. And Reeves's face had the color of a man who had calculated wrong about which direction pressure would ultimately travel, and the calculation could not be undone. And in Philadelphia, Margaret Whitmore was finishing a crossword puzzle at the kitchen table under the same lamp that had been there since Claire was 12. And she did not know that her daughter was sitting in a studio in Chelsea with her name on the deed and a note full of that people with real money had started to take seriously. And she would not know until Claire called on Sunday, which was when Claire always called. And in the coffee counter, a table was being cleared and 2 chairs were being set across from each other, And in 4 hours and 27 minutes, the most honest conversation of Vincent Marlowe's adult life was going to begin at that table. And he did not know yet how it would end, which was, for a man accustomed to knowing the outcome before the meeting, the most unnerving and also the most necessary thing he had experienced in a very long time. He was already there when she arrived. 7 o'clock exactly, and Vincent was sitting at the table in the back corner of the West Village coffee counter, with his coat still on and both hands around a cup he wasn't drinking from. A sound splitting, and Claire stood in the doorway for a moment, before he saw her long enough to observe him without the adjustment that happened to his posture and his face when he knew she was watching. He looked, in that unguarded moment, like a man carrying something heavy that he had been carrying for a long time and had stopped noticing the weight of until recently, when someone had made him aware of it again. Then he looked up and saw her and the adjustment happened not dishonest, not performance. Just the natural recalibration of a person who has been alone with their thoughts and suddenly is not, and she crossed the room and sat down across from him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The coffee counter had 3 other customers and low music and the smell of something being baked in the back, and it was as ordinary and as specific as it had been the first time they sat here, and Claire let that ordinariness hold the space for a few seconds before she began. "Tell me what you did," she said. "All of it, in order." He told her. It took 40 minutes. He did not rush it, and she did not let him rush it, and when he glossed over something, a name, a mechanism, a decision point, she stopped him and asked the question that made him go back and fill it in, and he filled it in. Every time. He did not deflect once, which she noticed, and which cost him something she could see it, costing him the particular strain of a man accustomed to operating behind layers of necessary opacity, being asked to take those layers down and stay down. He had called 3 people in the first 30 minutes after leaving her. A man named Ortega, who managed certain financial documentation within the organization and who had been, Vincent had suspected for 6 weeks, the secondary conduit through which Reeves's information was traveling. Not Reeves's co-conspirator, but an unwitting structural link that Reeves had exploited without Ortega's knowledge. He had called Ortega first to confirm the specific account pathway and to verify that the link to Claire's project expenses was exactly where Reeves had positioned it. It was. The second call was to the attorney, not the one he'd offered Claire, a different one, older. Someone who had navigated the specific territory between organized crime and federal investigation for 30 years, and understood how to approach federal investigators with information in a way that protected the provider, while maximizing the utility of what was being offered. This attorney had made contact with Marsh's office, not as a Marlowe representative, but as an independent source with documentation regarding an active investigation being manipulated from the inside. The documentation was Reeves's own records, 11 months of them, recovered from the organization's internal systems by Ortega in the window between Vincent's call and the approach to Marsh's office. Reeves had been meticulous. Meticulous people leave meticulous trails, and when those trails are handed to federal investigators who are already building a case, the case reorganizes itself around the new center of gravity with a speed that is not always comfortable to witness. The third call, Vincent said, was to someone whose name he did not give her, and whose role he described only as insurance, the specific kind of insurance that insured Daniel Reeves understood, before the federal conversation began, that whatever he considered doing with the hours between being approached by the documentation becoming official record was not an available option. Claire looked at him when he got to this part. "Insurance," she said. "Yes. That's the part I'm not going to know more about." It was not a question. He met her eyes. "That's the part you don't want to know more about," he said. "There's a difference, is there?" "Yes. One is me keeping things from you. The other is you making a choice about what you can carry and still do what you're trying to do." She held his gaze for a long moment. "Did anyone get hurt?" she said. "No," he said. No one was hurt. She believed him. She was not entirely sure. She believed him because she had assessed the evidence and found it convincing, or because she needed to believe him in order to continue. and she was honest enough with herself to hold both possibility simultaneously without resolving them prematurely. Reeves, she said. Federal custody as of this morning, Vincent said. The documentation was sufficient for immediate action. Chu is an attorney. He was retained for a purpose that no longer exists. He'll return to whatever he was doing before Reeves found him. He threatened me, she said. I know. That doesn't get a consequence? Raymond Chu made a phone call to a woman he believed was vulnerable and alone, Vincent said. In a week's time, he's going to understand that assessment was incorrect. The professional consequences of that misunderstanding will arrive on their own. She looked at him. Don't do anything that comes back to the studio. Nothing will come back to the studio, he said. Or to me. Or to you. He held her eyes steadily. I mean that. She looked at her coffee. The cup was warm under her hands, and the shop was warm around her, and she was extraordinarily tired, the deep, specific exhaustion that follows sustained fear, the kind that does not respond to sleep immediately, but requires a period of processing before the body will accept rest. I need to ask you something, she said, and I need you to understand that the answer changes things. Not necessarily ends things, but changes them. He waited. The dinner, she said. Preston Caldwell. Something moved across his face, not guilt exactly. Recognition. You arranged for him to be there, she said. I knew he was seeking a meeting, Vincent said carefully. You told me that. I'm asking if you arranged it. Pause. Long enough to be its own answer. I moved the timeline, Vincent said. He had been requesting a meeting for weeks. I accelerated the invitation to coincide with the evening I'd already planned. Because you knew I'd be there, yes. And you knew who he was to me. I knew what happened at the gala, he said. You didn't tell me directly. But you're not difficult to read, Claire, when something has left a mark. And I asked Marcus Davis about the gala after the fact, and Davis has the specific professional failing of knowing everything that happens at client events and having no discretion about sharing it. Claire sat with this for a moment. So you put him in the room, she said. As what? A gift? As a context, Vincent said. I wanted you to be in a room where he could see what you'd built. I thought you were owed that. I thought he was owed seeing it. He paused. I should have told you beforehand. I didn't, and that was wrong, and I'm telling you now that it was wrong. You made a decision about my life, she said, without consulting me. To give me an experience you thought I deserved. Yes, he said. That's not your call to make. I know that, he said. I know it now more clearly than I knew it then, and I knew it then enough that I should have done differently. She looked at her hands on the cup, and this was the part she had been working around for days without looking at directly. She had not hated that moment. Standing in the dining room in the emerald dress with Preston Caldwell's recalibration visible on his face across the room. She had not hated it. She had felt something in it that she had not entirely given herself permission to feel because it required acknowledging that she had wanted exactly that specific reversal, exactly that specific witness. And Vincent had known she wanted it before she had admitted it to herself, and he had arranged it. And that was a form of seeing her that was also a form of presuming to act on what he saw, and both of those things were simultaneously true. If you do something like that again, she said, I walk. I understand, not as a negotiating position, as a fact. I understand, he said again, the same voice, no qualification. She looked at him across the table. What happened to the Caldwell proposal? She said. I declined it, he said, before any of this. 3 weeks after the dinner. Not because of me. Not for you, he said carefully. The proposal had structural problems, independent of any personal consideration. The Caldwell Group is over-leveraged and undercapitalized, and Preston Caldwell has the specific deficiency of a man who has never been required to be competent because he has always been able to purchase competence around him. That's a bad investment on the merits. What happens to them now? What was already going to happen, he said. The market does what the market does. I didn't accelerate it, and I didn't protect against it. She nodded slowly. Okay, she said. He looked at her. Okay. I'm not done being angry, she said, about the dinner. I'm not putting it away because you explained it. It's going to be something I think about. I know. And there are going to be more conversations like this one, she said, where I need to understand something you did, and you explain it, and I decide whether I can carry it. And you don't get to preempt those conversations by managing what I know. Agreed. I mean it, she said. The moment that changes, I'm gone. I know you mean it, he said. That's not reassurance. That's me telling you I believe you. She drank her coffee. He drank his. The shop made its ordinary sounds around them. The studio is mine, she said. Yes, I'm going to repay the investment eventually. Not now, but eventually. That's not necessary. I didn't say it was necessary, she said. I said I'm going to do it. He looked at her for a moment and then nodded. Once, and did not argue, because he was learning. She could see him learning it in real time, that certain things she said were not invitations to discussion. I'm going to call Adeze tomorrow, she said, and Bertram. And I'm going to build this correctly, slowly if I have to. On terms that are mine. Yes, he said. And when I put my name on something, she said, it's going to mean exactly what I say it means. Nothing you did, nothing anyone connected to you did, is going to be attached to it in any way that isn't clean. Understood. I'm going to need time to make that true, she said. Franklin Cole thinks the federal conversation is effectively finished as far as I'm concerned. But I need to be careful for the next several months about what is visibly connected to what. I'll maintain distance, Vincent said, publicly. For as long as you need. Not just publicly, she said. Actually, I need room to build this without it being in the shadow of something larger. Yes, he said. And then after a moment, Claire. She looked at him. I'm sorry, he said. Not for a specific thing. Not an itemized apology, the kind that functions as a negotiation. I'm sorry for this, which implies the other things are acceptable. Just the two words, carrying the weight of everything they both knew, was in the room. She looked at him for a long time. I know, she said. She went home. She slept for 11 hours. She woke up at 9 in the morning and lay in bed for a while, feeling the specific quality of the morning, the way it had a different texture from the mornings of the previous week, as if the air itself had changed pressure. Not fixed, not clean and resolved, but breathable in a way it had not been. She called Evan at 9:30. How are you, she said. Better, sir, he said. I talked to the logistics company. The interview's confirmed. Good. Yeah. Are you actually okay? Not the thing you tell me, the actual thing. She looked at the ceiling of her apartment. The same ceiling she had looked at for 3 years. The water stain near the window that she had been meaning to report to the building management since she moved in. I made a lot of decisions in a short amount of time, she said. Some of them were mine, and some of them were made for me. I'm trying to sort out which ones I would have made myself if I'd had the chance. And most of them, she said. I think most of them I would have made myself. Something, Evan said. Yeah, she said, it is. She showered and dressed and went to the studio. She spent the morning doing nothing dramatic. She pressed the coat, it had been hanging for 5 days, and the lining needed refreshing at the seams from the humidity changes. She checked every piece on the rack with the systematic attention she gave in anything that had been sitting unwatched, looking for fabric distortion, for anything that had shifted or settled wrongly. Everything was fine. The work was the same quality it had been when she left it. She was not sure why she had expected otherwise, except that Sid had felt, during the worst of the past week, like the turbulence surrounding the work might somehow infect the work itself. It hadn't. She called Adeze at noon. Adeze answered on the second ring and spoke with the specific warmth of a woman who had made her assessment at the dinner and had not changed it in the intervening weeks. I was wondering when you'd surface, Adeze said. I had some things to manage, Claire said. Most interesting people do, Adeze said. Are you ready to talk about Chicago? I'm ready. The conversation lasted an hour and 20 minutes. The Chicago buyer's name was Harriet Osee, a sound like Greenbart, and she ran the buying department for a department store group with 4 locations in the Midwest that had been deliberately positioning itself as a home for emerging American designers, not the kind of store that waited for a label to become established and then offered shelf space, but the kind that made a bet early and absorbed the risk of it. Adaeze had sent Harriet photographs from the dinner. Harriet had called Adaeze the following week. She wants to commission a small capsule, Adaeze said. 8 to 12 pieces. Production quantities, not artisanal. She wants to know if that's something you can execute. Claire thought about Bertram's questions at the dinner. About production scale. About whether the construction methods were adaptable. Some of the pieces as designed would require adaptation, she said. Pleating on the skirt is hand-finished. At production scale, I'd need to modify the technique or price it accordingly. She expects to price it accordingly, Adaeze said. That's not the barrier. Then yes, Claire said. I can execute it. Good. A pause. There's something else. Harriet has a contact at a showroom that does trunk shows for independent labels. Seasonal. She thinks a trunk show appearance in the spring could serve as the launch context for the capsule. Claire sat down on the cutting table stool. That's a significant step, she said. Yes, Adaeze said. It is. I want to make sure you understand what I'm offering here, Claire, because I don't do this casually. I'm putting my relationship with Harriet into this. I'm doing that because I watched you in that dining room, and I thought, this person doesn't need someone to believe in her. She needs someone to open a door. Those are very different things. I understand the difference, Claire said. Then let's open the door, Adaeze said. After she hung up, Claire sat for a while without moving. She thought about the scholarship letter arriving on a Tuesday. About Margaret crying. About Evan not understanding why his sister was crying, but cheering anyway because it seemed like the right response. She thought about 36 applications and 12 polite rejections and the workroom at Hawthorne and Vale and the specific quality of making yourself invisible for long enough that invisibility starts to feel like safety. She thought about a navy dress with a hem that was 2 millimeters off on the left side. Dude skiing. She picked up her notebook and opened it to the page where she'd been sketching during the worst night of the past week the designs she'd made while her hands were shaking, and her breathing was shallow and the rest of. Her life was producing sounds she couldn't interpret. They were good. Even done in fear, even done with a trembling pencil grip, they were good. She didn't know exactly when she had become someone who made good things in the dark, but she had become that person, and that was not a thing that could be taken back. She called Franklin Cole and told him about the Chicago opportunity. Are there any restrictions I need to be aware of? She said. Given the past week. You're not a subject of any investigation, Cole said. You're not restricted from professional activity of any kind. Live your life, Ms. Whitmore. She called Bertram's office and left a message about the production scale conversation they'd begun at the dinner, saying she was ready to continue it when he had availability. Bertram called back himself within 2 hours, which told her something about how seriously he'd been weighing the dinner conversation. They spoke for 45 minutes about production. He had relationships with 3 domestic manufacturers who worked with independent designers at small batch scale. He would make introductions. He wanted to see the production-adapted specifications before the introductions happened, which was fair. He was not offering charity. He was offering infrastructure, and infrastructure had to be evaluated. The pleated skirt, he said, that's the piece that interests me most from a commercial standpoint. Women will wear that. The silhouette is right for where the market is going. I know, Claire said. It's been in my notebook for 3 years. Then it was ahead, he said. That's better than behind. She worked for the rest of the afternoon, making production notes. Adapting designs for manufacturing scale was a different kind of thinking, not worse than artisanal construction, not lesser, but different. It required thinking about a garment as a system rather than an object, about how each construction decision multiplied across hundreds of units and what that multiplication meant for cost and integrity and the specific qualities she was unwilling to compromise. She made mistakes in the notes and caught them and corrected them and made notes about the corrections. Around 5 o'clock, she stopped and stood up and stretched, and she walked to the rack and looked at the 6 pieces. 6 pieces was a portfolio. 8 to 12 pieces was a collection. She needed to start thinking in collection terms. She sat back down and opened the notebook to a clean page. She wrote at the top, Whitmore Spring. She looked at those 2 words for a moment. Then she started sketching. 3 weeks passed. In those 3 weeks, she did not see Vincent. They spoke twice by phone, brief calls. Factual, both of them honoring the distance she had asked for, in the way two people honor a necessary thing they would both prefer to be otherwise. Calls were not cold. They were careful. There is a difference, and she knew the difference by now. Evan went to the interview in the gray shirt. He called her from outside the building afterward. "How'd it go?" she said. "They offered me the job on the spot," he said. His voice was doing the thing, where he was trying not to sound like it mattered as much as it did. "You took it. I start Monday." "Good," she said. "Evan." "Yeah, the gray shirt." He laughed. Really laughed. She hadn't heard that particular laugh, uncomplicated, unguarded in months, and it hit her somewhere she hadn't expected. Yeah, he said. The gray shirt. She called her mother on Sunday. Margaret listened to the condensed version of the past month, without interrupting. When Claire finished, there was a long pause. "This man," Margaret said finally. "Vincent. Yes, he's complicated." "Yes, so was your father," Margaret said. "Not in the same way. But complicated is not automatically a problem. It's who he's complicated toward that matters." Claire held the phone and thought about this. "He was honest with me," she said, "even when honest was expensive for him." "Then you pay attention to that," Margaret said, "and you don't let the expensive things go unsaid. You say them while you have them to say." Claire looked at the studio from her apartment window, the Chelsea building, the high windows, the light she could see even from 2 blocks away. "I know, Mama," she said. "Come home for Christmas," Margaret said. "Bring the notebooks. I want to see." The conversation with Preston Caldwell she did not plan and did not seek. It happened on a sidewalk in the garment district, on a Thursday in December. She was coming out of a fabric supplier with 2 sample bolts under her arm, and he was walking in the opposite direction. And the city did what the city does, compress 12 million people into a geography where the unavoidable encounters happened on their own schedule, regardless of anyone's preference. He saw her first. She could see that he saw her, and she could see the specific calculation that happened in the half-second before he decided what to do with having seen her. Could have kept walking. The distance between them and the traffic and the general noise of the garment district on a Thursday afternoon would have made that easy, would have made it almost the path of least resistance. He stopped. "Ms. Whitmore," he said. She shifted the bolts under her arm and looked at him. He was not the same as he had been at the gala or even at the dinner. Not catastrophically different, Preston Caldwell was not a man who would ever look broken in public. His particular upbringing had made sure of that. But there was something around the edges of him that had been compressed, and she recognized the compression because she knew what it looked like from the inside. The look of someone whose assumed future has been revised and who has not yet fully negotiated with the revision. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, a pause. "I heard you have a studio," he said. "Opening in the new year." Word traveled in this city in ways that were not always trackable. She was not surprised he'd heard. "Yes," she said. "Congratulations," he said. She looked at him. She was trying to determine if it was genuine, and she thought it probably was, in the limited way that congratulations from someone who is simultaneously contending with his own losses can be genuine, real enough, just also complicated by context. "Thank you," she said. Another pause. The sidewalk moved around them, the city's indifferent current. "The gala," he said. She waited. He stopped. Started again. "What I said that night. How I behaved." He looked at a point somewhere past her left shoulder, which was how people looked when they were saying something that required getting to without looking at the thing directly. It was inexcusable. I knew it when I said it. I said it anyway. "Why?" she said. He looked at her then, a direct look, which cost him something she could see it costing him. "Because I could," he said. "Because the room would let me. Because you were wearing something that told me a story I could use, and I used it." He paused. "That's the honest answer. It's not a good answer." "No," she said. "It isn't. I'm not asking you to forgive it," he said. He stopped again. "I think about it. I want you to know I think about it." She looked at him for a long moment. The thing was, she had thought about Preston Caldwell on and off for months. She had thought about him the way you think about something that left a mark, not constantly, but in the way it surfaces when you're not defending against it. She had built things in the wake of that evening, and she had burned with it in the beginning, and she had set it aside, eventually not because it stopped mattering, but because she had found things that mattered more. I believe you, she said. I'm not sure what that's worth to you, but I believe you. He nodded. A small, careful nod. Is your family all right? She said. She said it because she meant it, not warmly, not with affection, but with the plain human acknowledgement that a person's family being in financial crisis was a real thing, regardless of how that person had behaved toward her. Something shifted on his face. Not quite surprise. Something more like the expression of a man who expected a certain kind of response and received a different kind, and did not know immediately what to do with the discrepancy. We're managing, he said. There's restructuring happening. Difficult. I'm sorry, she said. Are you, she said? Not unkindly, genuinely asking. She thought about it for a moment. Not in a comfortable way, she said, but yes. He looked at her. And something happened in his face that she had never expected to see there, not admiration exactly, not something with a clean name. Just the look of a man who has been shown a version of grace he did not earn and is surprised to discover that it feels worse than the alternative. Good luck with the studio, he said. Good luck with the restructuring, she said. They parted on the sidewalk, and the city absorbed them both, and that was the last time Claire Whitmore spoke to Preston Caldwell. The studio opened on a Tuesday in February. Small. Deliberately small. One room off a street in the garment district, a sign she had made herself from a piece of oak board and brass letters. A sign read simply Whitmore. She had spent 4 days installing the workroom and 2 days installing the front space where clients would eventually come for fittings and consultations, and one evening hanging the sign, standing on a stepladder in the cold with a drill, and Evan below holding the board steady and telling her it was slightly crooked, and her telling him she would drill the holes where the holes went and he should focus on his side. Crooked, he said. It's character, she said. Crooked, he said. She adjusted it 2 millimeters. Happy? Marginally, he said. She climbed down and they stood on the sidewalk and looked at it. Whitmore, her name. Just her name. Nothing explaining or qualifying or contextualizing. The name she had been born with and had carried through Philadelphia and the Institute and the workroom and the gala and the studio in Chelsea and the worst week of the preceding year, on a board in the garment district with brass letters in the cold February air. It looks good, Evan said. Yeah, she said. Mama's going to want a picture. I know. She took the picture. Vincent came to the opening. She had invited him directly through a text message, short and unambiguous. Opening Tuesday. Come if you want to. He came. He arrived 20 minutes after the small gathering of people she'd invited: Adeze, Bertram, Franklin Cole, 3 people from the Institute, a sound like green wood splitting, a supplier she'd developed a real working relationship with, and he stood slightly to the side of the room while she moved through it, and he did not insert himself, and he did not perform a role. When most people had gone, he looked at the work on the display rail, 2 pieces from the spring collection she'd already begun, hung as a preview of what Whitmore would offer, and he looked at them the way he looked at the notebook the night and opened it in the workroom. Completely, with nothing held back from the looking. How does it feel? He said. She was tidying the back table, not looking at him. Like the beginning of something, she said. Not the end of anything. Just the start. That's right, he said. She looked up at him then. They were alone in the studio. The brass letters on the sign were visible through the front window, catching the light from the street. Her notebook was open on the work table. The dress form in the corner had a half-constructed jacket on it, 3 weeks from finished, the kind of piece she would have described 3 years ago as too ambitious, and now was simply the next thing on the table. I want to try something, she said. With us. With whatever this is. He waited. Not what it was before, she said. Not the same shape. The past few months changed the shape of things, and I'm not going to pretend they didn't, and I'm not going to agree to a version that doesn't account for what I know now. What do you know now? He said. She looked at him. At the man who had sat in a client chair and watched her work and told her the truth when it was expensive to tell it, and who had also made decisions she hadn't consented to and moved her life around a board without fully asking permission, and who had spent 2 hours in a coffee counter dismantling his own opacity because she had asked him to. "I know that you're not a simple thing," she said. "I know I'm not either. I know that the parts of you that are dangerous are genuinely dangerous, and that the parts that aren't are also real, and that I have to decide every day which of those facts I'm going to lead with." "And," he said. "And I'm deciding," she said. "I'm deciding toward you, with conditions that don't change." "I know your conditions," he said. "Then we understand each other." "We understand each other," he said. She looked at him for another moment. Then she turned back to the table and picked up the notepad with tomorrow's task list and reviewed the call to Harriet Osie's office, the production meeting with one of Bertram's manufacturer contacts. Cutting she needed to start on the jacket collar. "You can go," she said. "I have work." She heard him pull on his coat. "Claire," he said. She looked up. "The notebooks," he said. He glanced at the one open on the work table and then at her. "There's more in them than one studio can hold." She looked at him. "I know," she said. He left. The door closed quietly behind him. She stood alone in Whitmore for a moment, her tools on the table, her work on the rail, and her notebook open, and the jacket waiting on the dress form, and she breathed. The city made its sounds outside. Cars and voices, and the distant percussion of a world that did not slow down for anyone's significant moments, that ran underneath all of it at the same indifferent pace. She had grown up in that sound, in a smaller version of it, in Philadelphia, and she had learned to work inside it, to find the specific quality of concentration that was not the absence of noise, but a relationship with it. She sat down at the work table. She pulled the notebook toward her and turned to the current page. The sketches from the worst night were there, the ones done, with shaking hands and shallow breath. She looked at them. They were good. She had stopped being surprised by this, by the fact that the best work sometimes arrived in the worst conditions, as if difficulty stripped away whatever was between the idea and the page. She picked up her pencil. She thought about what Vincent had said. More than one studio can hold. She thought about Harriet Osie and the Midwest and the Trunk Show in spring and Bertram's manufacturer contacts and Adaze's network and everything that was now in motion that had not been in motion a year ago. And she let herself feel the full weight of it, not the anxiety of it, not the uncertainty, but the actual mass of a real thing that was real, because she had made it real by refusing every available version of not trying. She had grown up with $43 and a second-hand zipper. She had made the dress that a man mocked in a ballroom and worn it without flinching and gone home on the subway and not let it choose the direction. She had sat in a workroom past 8 on a Tuesday evening and refused to let a flawed jacket walk out the door. She had filled 3 notebooks and kept them hidden for years because she was not sure she was allowed to want what she wanted, and then she had stopped hiding them. And the wanting had not disappeared on contact with reality. It had survived reality, which was the only test that mattered. She had walked through the worst week of her adult life and come out the other side with her name on a door. Pencil moved. She was designing something new, something that had not existed until this moment. That was being born directly from the accumulated weight of everything, the gala and the workroom and the coffee counter, and the Chelsea studio and the Federal Building's institutional corridors, and a sidewalk in the garment district, and a Tuesday. Opening in February, and a man who had looked at her notebooks and said they shouldn't be hidden. She did not know yet what the piece would be called. She did not name things until they were finished, until they existed in 3 dimensions and she could look at the completed object and hear the name it had been waiting for the whole time. She worked. The city ran underneath her, indifferent and alive. Her name was on the door, and late at night, when the studio went quiet and the street outside settled into its lower register, and the light above the work table was the only light left burning, Claire Whitmore sat with fabric spread across the table and thread between her fingers and a pencil moving across a page, and she was not waiting for anything, and she was not afraid of anything, and she was not performing anyone's idea of who a woman with her address and her history and her particular difficult year was supposed to become. She was just working, stitch by stitch, the way she always had, the way she always would.